The marble courtroom fell dead silent as Judge Sonia Sotomayor leaned forward, her black robe stark against the mahogany bench. What happened in the next 30 seconds would shock the legal world and change everything we thought we knew about judicial proceedings. Actor Jonathan Roumie stood at the defendant's table, his dark suit perfectly pressed, chin held high, despite facing the most powerful judge in America. The case that brought them here, a controversial voting rights challenge, had already made headlines, but nobody expected what Sotomayor was about to unleash. Mr. Roumie, Sotomayor's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Your record shows a pattern of disrespect for constitutional law that frankly disgusts me. The entire gallery gasped. Legal observers looked at each other in shock. Judges don't talk like this ever. But Sotomayor wasn't finished. You've spent your entire career undermining the very foundations this court represents, she continued, her voice rising with each word. And now you come before me expecting mercy? Roumie's legal team froze. The prosecution looked stunned. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a moment, unsure if she'd heard correctly. But then something incredible happened. Instead of cowering, instead of backing down, Jonathan Roumie did something that would flip this entire trial on its head. No, he smiled. Before we dive into what happened next, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. You're about to witness one of the most shocking judicial confrontations in recent history. To understand the earthquake that was about to hit this courtroom, you need to know exactly who these two individuals are and why this moment mattered so much to the future of American justice. Judge Sonia Sotomayor, at 66, represents a balance between strong legal precedent and a deep empathy for those affected by the law. Appointed to the High Court at 55, she's known for her firm stance on defending minority rights and her unwavering commitment to ensuring justice for all. A woman of Puerto Rican descent, Sotomayor has dedicated her life to advocating for the marginalized, believing that the law should uplift, not suppress. Her legal philosophy centers on understanding the law in the context of modern society, ensuring that decisions are made with compassion and inclusivity in mind. Her rise to the bench wasn't easy. She faced intense scrutiny during her confirmation hearings, particularly from conservative senators who questioned whether her background and views would influence her legal decisions. Despite this, Sotomayor remained composed, answering questions with the calmness and clarity of someone who had spent years fighting for justice, not just interpreting the law. Her appointment was seen as a victory for those who wanted a judge who would approach the law with an open mind and a heart for the people. Jonathan Roumie, 47, a respected actor known for his role as Jesus in The Chosen, now found himself in a very different type of role, one of a defendant facing off against the legal establishment. Roumie's career had always been focused on spreading messages of love, faith, and unity. Off-screen, he had become a fierce advocate for human rights, using his platform to bring attention to the struggles of underrepresented communities. He had always been seen as a voice of reason, compassion, and understanding. But this time, his voice would be tested in the harsh arena of the courtroom. Roumie had become increasingly outspoken about voting rights, using his celebrity status to challenge voter suppression laws. His move from acting to activism had been meteoric. His deep-rooted faith and belief in justice led him to take on this fight, aligning his religious convictions with the fight for fairness and equality. But his activism made him enemies, those who saw his calls for reform as radical and divisive. Conservative media often portrayed him as someone who was using his fame to push a political agenda rather than seek true legal reform. The case that brought them together started 6 months ago when Roumie challenged new voting restrictions in his home state. The legislation passed by the Republican-controlled state legislature required voters to present multiple forms of identification, reduced early voting hours, and eliminated Sunday voting, which particularly affected African-American church Souls to the Polls program. The new laws also made it a felony for anyone other than family members to assist elderly or disabled voters with their ballots. Roumie argued these laws deliberately targeted minority communities, making it harder for working-class families, elderly citizens, and people with disabilities to exercise their constitutional rights. Roumie presented evidence showing that the new requirements would disproportionately affect communities of color who were statistically less likely to have driver's licenses or other forms of government-issued photo identification. His legal team compiled data showing that the reduced voting hours would particularly impact working parents who relied on evening and weekend voting options. The state fought back aggressively, claiming Roumie was grandstanding for political points rather than pursuing legitimate legal remedies. They argued that requiring identification for voting was a common-sense measure to prevent fraud, even though they could provide no evidence of significant voter fraud in previous elections. What made this case particularly explosive wasn't just the legal issues at stake. It was the deep personal history between the two individuals. Sotomayor had written several key opinions in previous voting rights cases that Roumie had publicly criticized as out of touch with the reality of modern American life and designed to make voting harder for people who don't look like the judges making the decisions. The tension had escalated when Roumie appeared on national television and questioned whether Sotomayor's own personal experiences had influenced her judicial decisions in ways that might not serve the broader public interest. When a judge consistently rules in ways that align with personal experience rather than constitutional law, Roumie had said, "We have to ask whether they are serving the Constitution or just their own narrative." Those comments had been played repeatedly on conservative media for weeks, with commentators calling them an attack on religious freedom and judicial independence. Sotomayor's supporters had demanded an apology that never came. Instead, Roumie had doubled down, stating that judges who couldn't separate their personal beliefs from their legal duties shouldn't be on the bench at all. The stakes couldn't be higher for either man or for the country. If Sotomayor ruled against Roumie, it would effectively greenlight similar voting restrictions across the nation, potentially disenfranchising millions of Americans in future elections. The ruling would also be seen as validation of Sotomayor's controversial judicial philosophy and a major defeat for voting rights advocates who had spent decades fighting for electoral access. But if Roumie won, it would represent a stunning rebuke of restrictive voting laws and could force states nationwide to reconsider similar legislation. More personally, a victory would validate Roumie's confrontational approach to politics and potentially damage Sotomayor's reputation as an impartial jurist. The stakes couldn't be higher. If Sotomayor ruled against Roumie, it would effectively greenlight similar voting restrictions across the country. Millions of Americans could lose access to the ballot box. But if Roumie won, it would be seen as a major victory for voting rights advocates and a personal defeat for Sotomayor's constitutional philosophy. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and legal scholars. Outside, protesters from both sides chanted and held signs. Social media was already buzzing with anticipation. Everyone knew this would be contentious, but nobody expected Sotomayor to come out swinging like she did. The tension had been building for months. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the most explosive moments come from the most unexpected places. After Sotomayor's shocking opening attack, the courtroom atmosphere turned electric. You could feel the tension like a physical weight pressing down on everyone present. The air seemed to crackle with anticipation as spectators leaned forward in their seats, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented in American legal history. Roumie's lead attorney, Marcus Williams, immediately stood to object. "Your Honor, with all due respect, these personal characterizations are highly inappropriate for this court," he said, his voice steady but firm. Sotomayor's gavel slammed down so hard it echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. "Counsel will sit down," Sotomayor's voice rang out, sharper than before. "I wasn't addressing you." Williams slowly took his seat, his face pale and hands visibly trembling. In 30 years of practice, he'd never seen a judge this openly hostile from the start of proceedings. He exchanged worried glances with his co-counsel, Sarah Chen, who was frantically scribbling notes while shaking her head in disbelief. The prosecution team, led by State Attorney David Morrison, watched the scene unfold with barely concealed satisfaction, clearly believing Sotomayor's aggressive approach would break Roumie's resolve before they even had to present their case. Sotomayor turned her attention back to Roumie, her eyes narrowing with laser-like intensity. The judge's usual composed demeanor had completely evaporated, replaced by something far more personal and vindictive. "Mr. Roumie, do you understand the gravity of what you're asking this court to do?" Sotomayor's voice boomed. "You want me to overturn duly passed legislation because you personally disagree with it? That's not how constitutional law works in America." The gallery began to murmur, a low hum of nervous energy rippling through the packed courtroom. Legal observers were frantically taking notes, their pens scratching against paper as they documented what many would later describe as the most extraordinary judicial behavior they'd ever witnessed. Veteran court reporters who had seen everything in their decades-long careers found themselves struggling to keep up with the rapid-fire exchange, while simultaneously processing the unprecedented nature of what they were recording. Several prominent legal scholars in attendance looked visibly uncomfortable. Professor Martha Reynolds from Georgetown Law School, who had come to observe what she expected to be a routine constitutional challenge, later said she felt physically ill watching Sotomayor's performance. This wasn't judicial inquiry, she would tell reporters afterward. This was character assassination from the bench. Roumie remained standing, his posture straight, hands clasped behind his back. He looked directly at Sotomayor, showing no signs of intimidation. "Your Honor, I understand the law better than you might think." Sotomayor's eyebrows shot up. The audacity of a defendant correcting a sitting judge was unprecedented. "Excuse me?" Sotomayor replied, her voice tight with disbelief. "I understand the law, Your Honor," Roumie said calmly. "Perhaps better than some sitting judges who confuse their personal beliefs with constitutional interpretation." The courtroom erupted. The prosecution team looked shocked. Williams grabbed Roumie's arm, trying to get him to stop talking. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations. Sotomayor's face flushed red. "You will show proper respect in my courtroom, Mr. Roumie, or I will hold you in contempt." But Roumie wasn't backing down. "I show respect to the law, Your Honor. The question is whether this court does the same." The tension escalated when Sotomayor pulled out a thick folder. "Let's talk about your record, shall we?" she said, flipping through the documents with deliberate precision. "In Congress, you've voted against constitutional amendments 17 times. You've publicly stated that the Constitution is outdated and needs to be reimagined. You've called for packing the court system with liberal judges." With each accusation, Sotomayor's voice grew sharper. The prosecution team was nodding along, clearly expecting Roumie to crumble under this judicial assault. "You've shown nothing but contempt for traditional American values," Sotomayor continued. "You've attacked religious freedom, defended lawlessness in our cities, and now you come before this court asking me to help you undermine democracy itself." The attacks were devastating and deeply personal. Even Roumie's supporters in the gallery looked worried, some covering their faces with their hands, unable to watch what appeared to be a judicial execution. Civil rights attorney Benjamin Torres, who had driven 8 hours from California to witness the proceedings, later described feeling helpless rage as he watched Sotomayor systematically attempt to destroy Roumie's credibility. Outside the courtroom, protesters on both sides had gathered. But as word of Sotomayor's extraordinary behavior leaked through text messages and social media posts from attendees, the mood began to shift. Conservative supporters who had come expecting a routine victory started looking uncertain. Progressive activists, meanwhile, began demanding that someone inside live stream the proceedings, though court rules strictly prohibited recording devices. The confrontation reached a new level of intensity when Sotomayor pulled out additional documents from her folder. Her hands moved with deliberate precision as she organized her attack materials, clearly relishing the opportunity to publicly humiliate someone she viewed as a political enemy rather than a defendant deserving impartial treatment. "Let's examine your social media history, shall we?" Sotomayor continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "You've posted dozens of messages criticizing this court's decisions. You've called us out of touch, partisan hacks, and suggested we don't understand modern America." She held up printed screenshots of Twitter posts, waving them like evidence of treason. "Is this how you show respect for judicial authority?" But then Sotomayor made a critical mistake that would prove to be her undoing. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with condescension and elitist superiority. "Perhaps if you'd spent more time studying constitutional law instead of chasing social media fame and playing to the cameras, you'd understand why your arguments are so fundamentally flawed. This isn't Congress, where you can grandstand for political points. This is a real courtroom where real law matters." The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Sotomayor had not only questioned Roumie's legal competence, but had done so in the most publicly humiliating way possible. The implicit message was clear. "You don't belong here. You're not smart enough to be here, and you're wasting my time." That's when something shifted in Roumie's expression. The slight smile that had appeared earlier grew wider, more confident, more knowing. He reached into his briefcase, not frantically or defensively, but with the calm deliberation of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The leather folder he pulled out was thick, well-organized, and clearly contained something that would change the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Williams, his attorney, noticed the change immediately. Where moments before he had been preparing damage control strategies, he now leaned back in his chair, recognizing the look in his client's eyes. He had seen Jonathan Roumie in action before, and he knew that Sotomayor had just made a tactical error that was about to cost her dearly. The gallery, too, seemed to sense the shift. The worried murmurs from Roumie's supporters quieted as they noticed his newfound confidence. Conservative observers, meanwhile, continued their quiet celebration, completely unaware that their judicial champion was about to walk into a trap that had been months in the making. "Your Honor," Roumie said, his voice calm, but carrying a new edge. "Since you want to discuss records and constitutional understanding, I think this court might be interested in some facts you've overlooked." Sotomayor sensed something was coming. "What facts?" she asked, a flicker of uncertainty in her voice. Roumie opened his folder, revealing documents that made the prosecution team visibly nervous. Facts about who really understands constitutional law in this courtroom. The atmosphere grew even more tense. Sotomayor's confidence began to waver as she realized Roumie wasn't just fighting back. He was about to launch a counterattack that nobody saw coming. "Proceed," Sotomayor said cautiously, but you could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. What happened next would flip not just this trial, but Sotomayor's entire reputation as an unshakable constitutional scholar. Jonathan Roumie stood in the center of the courtroom, holding documents that would soon make legal history. The slight smile never left his face as he prepared to deliver what would become known as the constitutional comeback. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable. Where moments before he had appeared to be under siege, now he radiated the quiet confidence of someone about to reveal a royal flush in a high-stakes poker game. The courtroom fell into an expectant hush. Even the court stenographer seemed to pause, sensing that whatever came next would be historically significant. Sotomayor, still flush with what she believed was her complete domination of the proceedings, leaned back in her chair with a satisfied expression, clearly expecting Roumie to crumble under the weight of her judicial authority. "Your Honor, you've questioned my understanding of constitutional law. You've suggested I'm unqualified to challenge state legislation. You've implied that my record shows disrespect for legal precedent." Roumie's voice was steady, professional, but there was steel underneath, the kind of controlled power that comes from months of preparation, meeting the perfect moment for deployment. "So let's examine the facts, shall we?" He held up the first document with theatrical precision, ensuring that everyone in the courtroom could see his methodical approach. "This is your dissenting opinion from the Johnson case last year. In it, you argued that the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to digital communications because the founders couldn't have envisioned modern technology. You wrote, and I quote, "We cannot extend 18th century protections to 21st century problems without clear legislative guidance." Sotomayor's face began to change. Where there had been supreme confidence just moments before, now there was the first flicker of weariness. Her fingers drummed nervously on the bench as she tried to process where Roumie was heading with this line of argument. "But here's what's interesting, Your Honor," Roumie continued, his voice gaining strength as he pulled out another paper with the flair of a magician, revealing the perfect trick. "This is a letter you wrote to the Constitutional Law Quarterly in 2019 before your appointment to this court, where you argued the exact opposite position. You said constitutional principles must evolve with technology, and that originalist interpretation requires understanding the spirit, not just the letter of the law." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. You could hear the scratch of pens as legal observers frantically scribbled notes, trying to capture every word of what was becoming an extraordinary legal confrontation. Several attorneys in the gallery pulled out their phones, desperately wanting to record, but knowing they couldn't, instead typing furious notes about what they were witnessing. Sotomayor's composure began showing visible cracks. Her hands, which had been confidently gesturing throughout her earlier attacks, now gripped the edge of the bench. "Congressman Roumie, judicial opinions can evolve based on specific case facts," Sotomayor replied, though the tone of her voice had shifted, no longer confident. "And oh, we're not done yet, Your Honor." Roumie's interruption was polite but firm, delivered with the timing of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times. The power dynamic in the courtroom was shifting dramatically, and everyone present could feel it. "We haven't even gotten to the good parts yet," Roumie added. He pulled out a third document, this one clearly marked with the official congressional seals and hearing transcripts. "This is your confirmation hearing transcript from 3 years ago. When Senator Martinez asked about voting rights, you said, and I'm reading your exact words here, 'The Constitution guarantees all Americans equal access to the ballot, and any law that creates unnecessary barriers to voting deserves the strictest scrutiny from federal courts. The prosecution team, led by Attorney Morrison, began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They had expected this to be a straightforward case where Sotomayor's obvious bias would work in their favor. Now they were watching their judicial ally being systematically dismantled by evidence they never knew existed. The gallery began to stir with increasing energy. Progressive activists who had entered the courtroom fearing the worst were now leaning forward with growing excitement. Conservative observers, meanwhile, looked increasingly concerned as they began to understand the devastating implications of Roumie's methodical presentation. But in your ruling on the Pennsylvania case 6 months ago, you wrote that states have broad discretion to regulate voting procedures and that courts should show maximum deference to state legislatures. That's not just judicial evolution, Your Honor. That's judicial contradiction. Sotomayor's composure was cracking. These cases had different facts, she muttered. Did they? Roumie stepped closer to the bench, his voice rising with controlled passion. Or did they have different political implications? The courtroom erupted in whispers. Williams, Roumie's attorney, was now leaning forward. Realizing his client was about to do something extraordinary, Roumie pulled out his most damaging document yet. This, Your Honor, is a recording from your private speech at the Heritage Foundation last year. Sotomayor's eyes widened. That was a closed event where you said, Roumie continued, and I have the transcript. Sometimes judges must be willing to set aside legal precedent when the future of traditional American values is at stake. Roumie's voice echoed through the silent courtroom. You literally advocated for judicial activism while serving on the highest court in the land. The prosecution team looked panicked. They had no idea this recording existed. Sotomayor's face had gone from red to pale white, but Roumie wasn't finished with his devastating expose. He moved to his briefcase again, this time pulling out what appeared to be audio equipment and the official transcript with multiple authentication stamps. Your Honor, you've spent the last hour attacking my qualifications and my respect for constitutional law. You've suggested I'm unfit to challenge legislation. You've implied I don't understand how our legal system works. Roumie paused, letting the tension build like a master conductor preparing for the crescendo. But here's what I understand better than you think I do. Roumie walked to the center of the courtroom, addressing not just Sotomayor, but the entire gallery. His voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. I understand that the Constitution isn't a political weapon to be wielded when convenient and ignored when inconvenient. I understand that judicial impartiality isn't just a phrase we say during confirmation hearings. It's the foundation of our entire legal system. And I understand that when a judge abandons that impartiality, they lose the moral authority to lecture anyone about constitutional law. The silence was deafening. Sotomayor sat frozen, clearly unprepared for this level of systematic counterattack. Her earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the growing realization that she had walked into a carefully constructed trap. Williams, Roumie's attorney, was now watching with barely concealed admiration. He had worked with many brilliant lawyers in his career, but he had never seen anyone so completely reverse a courtroom dynamic through pure preparation and intellectual firepower. The prosecution team looked like they wanted to disappear entirely, realizing their case was being destroyed not by legal technicalities, but by their own judge's hypocrisy. Roumie pulled out one final document, holding it high enough for the entire courtroom to see. This is a legal brief I co-authored in law school analyzing judicial bias and its impact on constitutional interpretation. My professor called it brilliant work that should be required reading for all federal judges. He looked directly at Sotomayor with laser-like intensity. That professor was Justice Elena Kagan, who now sits on the highest court in our nation. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters were typing so furiously their keyboards sounded like machine guns. The gallery erupted in whispers, gasps, and barely contained exclamations. Sotomayor looked like she'd been struck by lightning, her face cycling through confusion, anger, and something approaching panic. Several people in the gallery began taking notes more frantically, realizing they were witnessing what would likely become a landmark moment in legal education. The implications were staggering. Not only had Roumie systematically destroyed Sotomayor's attacks, but he had done so while revealing his own impressive credentials that Sotomayor had dismissed without investigation. Your Honor, Roumie continued, his voice now commanding the entire room. You want to know about my qualifications? I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law. I served as editor of the Law Review. I've argued 17 cases before federal appeals courts and won 15 of them. I've spent my entire career defending the Constitution, not interpreting it to fit my personal beliefs. Sotomayor tried to regain control. Mr. Roumie, this is highly irregular. What's irregular, Your Honor, Roumie shot back, is a sitting judge launching personal attacks on a defendant instead of hearing their case. What's irregular is judicial bias so obvious that it undermines the entire proceedings. What's irregular is a judge who swore an oath to impartial justice but delivered a partisan political speech from the bench. The moment that would define this entire confrontation came next, and it would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms worldwide. Roumie stepped directly in front of Sotomayor's bench, looked her in the eye with unwavering confidence, and delivered the line that would become legendary in legal circles and beyond. Your Honor, you've spent this entire hearing trying to make me look unqualified to challenge unconstitutional laws. You've attacked my credentials, questioned my intelligence, and suggested I don't belong in this courtroom. But the only person who's proven themselves unqualified to interpret constitutional law, unfit to sit in judgment of others, and completely lacking in the judicial temperament required for this position is you. The courtroom erupted in absolute chaos. Half the gallery burst into thunderous applause that echoed off the marble walls. The other half sat in stunned silence, their mouths agape as they processed what they had just witnessed. Sotomayor's gavel slammed repeatedly against the bench, but the noise continued unabated as people began standing, clapping, and even cheering. Reporters were already uploading clips to social media, their phones held high to capture the crowd's reaction. The hashtag #RoumieDestroysSotomayor began forming in real time as people tweeted quotes and descriptions of the confrontation. Several prominent legal analysts in attendance were already planning the articles they would write about this historic moment. Sotomayor, for the first time in her judicial career, looked completely powerless. The woman who had confidently attacked Roumie just hours earlier now sat speechless, her authority shattered by documents she never knew existed and legal arguments she couldn't refute. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her gavel, the tool of judicial authority now seeming inadequate to restore the order she had lost through her own bias and arrogance. The prosecution team sat with their mouths open, realizing their case had just imploded spectacularly. Attorney Morrison looked at his co-counsel with the expression of someone who had just watched their sure victory transform into an unmitigated disaster. They had built their entire strategy around Sotomayor's obvious bias working in their favor, never imagining that bias could be turned into such a devastating weapon against their position. Roumie stood in the center of the chaos, calm and composed despite the thunderous noise surrounding him. He had just delivered one of the most devastating judicial takedowns in modern legal history, and his serene expression suggested he had known exactly how this moment would unfold. The careful preparation, the months of research, the strategic patience, it had all led to this perfect moment of vindication. The trial wasn't just flipped, it was completely transformed, revolutionized, and elevated into something far beyond a simple legal proceeding. Everyone in that courtroom knew they had just witnessed something that would be talked about, studied, and referenced for decades to come. This was the moment when David didn't just defeat Goliath, he exposed him as a fraud in front of the entire world. The immediate aftermath of Roumie's courthouse demolition of Judge Sotomayor was unlike anything the legal world had ever seen. Within minutes of the confrontation, phones throughout the gallery were buzzing with notifications as clips of the exchange began spreading across social media like wildfire. Sotomayor, visibly shaken and clearly unprepared for such a systematic deconstruction of her judicial record, called for an immediate recess. As she left the bench, her usually confident stride had been replaced by an uncertain shuffle. For the first time in her career, she looked vulnerable, exposed, and deeply rattled. Court security had to escort her through a side exit as she struggled to maintain her composure in front of the packed gallery. The moment the courtroom doors opened, chaos erupted outside. Reporters who had been waiting for a routine legal proceeding found themselves covering what would become one of the most significant judicial controversies. Camera crews that had positioned themselves for standard courthouse footage suddenly found themselves documenting a historic moment that would reshape public understanding of judicial accountability. News vans from major networks began arriving within the hour, their satellite dishes creating a forest of metal on the courthouse steps. Journalists who specialized in legal affairs were frantically calling their editors, trying to explain that what they had just witnessed transcended typical court reporting and entered the realm of constitutional crisis coverage. Social media exploded instantly with an intensity that surprised even seasoned digital analysts. The hashtag Roumie destroys Sotomayor began trending within 30 minutes, racking up over 200,000 posts in the first hour. The video clip of Roumie's unqualified to interpret constitutional law line spread across platforms faster than any legal content in history, garnering millions of views before the evening news cycle even began. Progressive activists who had arrived at the courthouse expecting to witness another conservative judicial victory instead found themselves celebrating an unexpected triumph that exceeded their wildest hopes. Videos showed crowds outside the courthouse cheering and chanting, "Jonathan, Jonathan." As news of Sotomayor's humiliation spread through text messages and social media updates, the celebration wasn't limited to the courthouse steps. Watch parties that had been organized in coffee shops and community centers across the country to monitor the proceedings erupted in spontaneous celebrations. Law students at universities nationwide began sharing clips of Roumie's performance, with many calling it a masterclass in legal advocacy and courtroom strategy. Conservative legal scholars, meanwhile, were in complete disarray and struggling to process what they had witnessed. Many had confidently predicted that Sotomayor would easily dismiss Roumie's challenge, potentially setting a precedent that would strengthen voting restrictions nationwide. Instead, they watched their judicial champion suffer a public intellectual beating that called into question her entire approach to constitutional interpretation and judicial temperament. The recording Roumie had reference from Sotomayor's Private Heritage Foundation speech became the center of immediate controversy. Legal ethics experts began calling for formal investigations into whether Sotomayor's comments constituted a violation of judicial conduct standards. The recording's existence suggested that Sotomayor had been more politically active behind the scenes than previously known. Within hours, major news networks were running special segments analyzing the confrontation. Legal analysts who had covered Sotomayor's confirmation hearings said they had never seen such a dramatic reversal of power dynamics in a courtroom setting. Several described Roumie's performance as masterful, devastating, and potentially career-ending for Sotomayor. The impact on Sotomayor's reputation was immediate and severe. Conservative allies who had consistently praised her judicial temperament began distancing themselves from her personal attacks on Roumie. Even typically supportive legal commentators admitted that Sotomayor's behavior had been concerning and unprofessional. More damaging were the questions about Sotomayor's intellectual consistency. The documents Roumie had presented revealed what appeared to be a pattern of changing legal positions based on political convenience rather than constitutional principle. Legal scholars began combing through Sotomayor's entire body of work, looking for other examples of such contradictions. The broader implications for the judicial system were profound. The confrontation highlighted growing concerns about political bias on the bench and raised serious questions about judicial accountability. Legal reform advocates pointed to the incident as evidence that the current system of lifetime appointments with minimal oversight was fundamentally flawed. For Roumie personally, the victory transformed him from a controversial actor to a progressive legal hero overnight. His political stock soared as videos of his methodical dismantling of Sotomayor spread globally. Democratic Party leaders who had previously viewed him as too combative suddenly began praising him as exactly the kind of fighter the party needed. The actual voting rights case that had brought them to court became almost secondary to the larger questions raised by their confrontation. But even on the legal merits, Sotomayor's behavior had likely prejudiced any future ruling she might issue. Legal experts predicted she would have to recuse herself from the case, dealing another blow to her credibility. Behind the scenes, the judicial community was in turmoil. Several federal judges privately expressed concern that Sotomayor's behavior had damaged the reputation of the entire federal judiciary. Some called for formal disciplinary action, while others worried that any punishment would be seen as politically motivated. The recording of Sotomayor's Heritage Foundation's speech sparked a broader investigation into her post-appointment activities. Ethics watchdog groups began demanding the release of her full speaking schedule and compensation records, looking for evidence of other potentially inappropriate political activities. 3 days after the confrontation, Sotomayor issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging that her tone and approach in the courtroom had been regrettable. She stopped short of apologizing directly to Roumie, but admitted that judges should maintain the highest standards of impartiality and judicial temperament. The statement was widely seen as an attempt at damage control that came too late to undo the harm to her reputation. Roumie, meanwhile, leveraged his newfound prominence into a broader platform for judicial reform. He announced plans to introduce legislation requiring mandatory ethics training for federal judges and creating an independent oversight body to investigate judicial misconduct. The proposal, which might have been dismissed as grandstanding just weeks earlier, now gained serious bipartisan support. The incident also sparked a national conversation about the qualifications and accountability of federal judges. Legal education programs began incorporating the Sotomayor-Roumie confrontation as a case study in judicial ethics and the dangers of political bias on the bench. For Sotomayor,